right, everyone, as we do still have people logging in, I'm just going to give some quick announcements before we get started. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We want to start off by letting you all know that we have recordings of this session, and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask any of your speakers a question during the session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen. On the right of your screen is also the chat window where you're able to engage with other attendees and your presenters. And finally, we ask that you keep your microphones and your cameras off during the presentations and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones on. So that is all I have. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to pass it over to Arun to get us started. Go ahead and take over.
All right. Thank you, Anthony. I'm going to share my slide. End of this slide. So is everything perfect?
It is.
Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Arun Regmi. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management at Penn State University. So today's presentation topic is the value of prescribed burning in the Northeastern forest. This is my part of my dissertation work, and this research was first conducted in Pennsylvania. Later, we got Graduate Research Innovation Award from Joint Fire Science Program to expand the similar study across the Northeastern region. So this presentation will basically include the preliminary finding of the expanded study. So before I get started, I would like to thank my advisor, Dr. Melissa Cry, and committee member, Dr. Jesse Cry, for providing this research opportunity to me. And I'd like to acknowledge National Institute of Food and Agriculture, NIFA, and Joint Fire Science Program for funding this study. And I also like to acknowledge collaborators from different states, Pennsylvania Prescribed Fire Council, New York Forest Owners Association, and University of Maryland Extension. With that, I'd like to start the presentation. So prescribed fire is carefully planned and executed event. It is a common forestry management practice in the Southeast and West. However, very few acres has been burned in the Northeast. You can see only 3% of prescribed burn activities have been occurred in this Northeast region. But if we look at the trend over a few years, it's actually the prescribed burning has received considerable attention, and it's actually in the increasing trend. So there is the prescribed fire could be a viable option for managing forest resources in this region. So how can prescribed fire can benefit the forest ecosystem in this region? So there are several benefits of using prescribed fire. For example, it helps to reduce the excessive fuel load and lower the risk of wildfire hazard. It also helps to promote regeneration of fire-dependent tree species. For example, oak is one of the important tree species found in this Northeast region that has historically relied on the fire. So due to the decade of fire suppression policy, this type of forest-dependent ecosystem has gradually been replaced by less valuable fire-intolerant species. So in such condition, reintroduction of fire through prescribed burn could help to restore this kind of fire-dependent ecosystem. In addition, prescribed fire can help in wildlife habitat management and landscape restoration as well. So recognizing those benefits and need for the prescribed burn, many states in the Northeast have already enacted Prescribed Fire Act and policies to provide a legal framework for burning. And here you can see some of the example in the states that has the Prescribed Burning Act and policies. After all these legal provision, prescribed fire activities have been steadily increased in this region. However, the most of the burning is being conducted on the public lands. So the question arises here, what about the burning on private lands? Even though 70% of forests in this region are privately owned and consist of fire-dependent ecosystems, there is virtually no burning on private land. So prescribed fire could be a viable option for forest management on private lands. However, standards are limiting, and also resources are also limiting for landowners to burn in this region. So there is an important to understand the interest of this largest ownership group in using prescribed fire as a management tool to achieve larger scale burning success. So to fill this knowledge gap, this study aims to evaluate landowner demand for a range of prescribed burning programs and associated ecological benefit, which is the willingness to pay for using prescribed fire, and also aims to identify how landowner knowledge, perception, and attitude influence informing landowner preferences and willingness to pay for prescribed fire. Currently, we have included 3 states in this study: the Pennsylvania, New York, and the Maryland, and we are in the process of including other states in future. But so far, we have data from the New York and Pennsylvania, and we conducted a landowner survey using Likert scale questions to measure landowner knowledge and perception of prescribed fire, and also the trust in prescribed fire implementers. And then we used choice experiment questions to measure their willingness to pay for a range of prescribed fire programs, and some landowner characteristic questions at the end. So here's the overview of the choice experiment and the choice set formation. In the choice experiment, we use 5 attributes, 2 representing the benefit of prescribed fire, and other 2 represents the possible barrier to implement prescribed fire. On top of that, we also included the cost factor. This helps to evaluate the welfare of prescribed fire and also the values of prescribed fire in this region. So each attribute has 4 levels, and using factorial design, we created 16 different programs, and each program consists of 1 level of each attribute. And there was 16 different programs with different combination of these kind of levels from each factors. For example, the program 1 helps to promote the oak regeneration at a reduced management cost and provide training to landowner and the reduced liability risk from escape fire. And the cost to enroll in this program would be $20. So the landowner were asked whether they were willing to enroll in this program or not. And the final survey was distributed both by mail and the web using the Qualtrics software. In Pennsylvania, 644 surveys were mailed. Out of that, we received 227 usable responses. And from Newark, where the data collection is ongoing, we sent 600 postcard invitation to requesting to participate in the survey. And we have so far 49 responses from the Newark, and the data collection process is ongoing. In Maryland too, but we don't have response from there. So in this preliminary analysis, I have used a 275 observation, sorry, from this Pennsylvania and Newark. And here is the preliminary result of this study, and some demographic characteristics. Most respondents were male and had education level of bachelor degree and more. Likewise, about 60% of respondents had annual income over 80,000 and owned forest more than 100 acres. And also 63% respondents were associated with any kind of private or professional landowner association, whereas majority were involved already in assistant program. So compared to Newark respondents, more Pennsylvania respondents were younger, had less income level, more in assistance program or the landowner association, and fewer with the graduate level education, and own larger forest size. This shows that Pennsylvania landowners are more active compared to the Newark forest landowner. And the overall responded placed higher priority on ecosystem health and wildlife related benefit, for example, to enhance the wildlife population recreation related benefit. And here's the result of the knowledge and perception and trust level. We found a low level of knowledge in the landowner and higher trust level, but in the trust, professional prescribed fire implementers were trusted somewhat more than the trained landowners, and there was a lower perception of risk. So comparing, they responded from Newark to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania responded have higher knowledge and trust level, whereas lower risk perception. So this is the preliminary demand of the analysis of demand for prescribed fire. We found a significant demand for prescribed burn as 72% of respondents elected at least one program out of 16 different scenarios. Results showed that Pennsylvania respondents are more likely to accept the program than the Newark respondent, but we're still in the process of getting responses from Newark, so this figure might change in the future. But still, we have 56% landowners who elected to enroll in the prescribed fire programs. So the likelihood to enroll in the program decreased with the program cost as most accepted the low cost programs. However, there is still a significant number of respondents from the high cost program. So this variation in the willingness to pay values might have been influenced by several factors. In the next slide, I will talk about the factors affecting their decision making. So this is just a overview of the regression analysis where we found some factor had a negative impact, significant impact on the landowner willingness to pay, and some had a positive, significant impact on landowner willingness to pay. I will discuss in brief about this factor in the next slide. So in general, we found 4 key factors influencing the landowner decision-making and enrolling in any kind of prescribed fire programs. So the first factor is the cost of burning. Increasing cost of burning, the likelihood to enroll in the program decreases. So we also found higher trust, likely to increase the willingness to pay value. And if there is a high risk, there's likely to reduce the value of prescribed fire. And also, there are some potential benefits, which are the program attributes. So there are 4 attributes, actually 3 attributes that are likely to increase the mean willingness to pay value of the prescribed burn. For example, having some the program attribute that maintains forest health, resilience, and diversity, and provide opportunity to apply for financial assistance, and that helps to control ticks and diseases, likely to increase the value of prescribed fire program, because these factors were preferred mostly by the landowner. And there are other factors which are the least preferred program attributes. So if we focus on the least preferred program attributes, the overall value of prescribed burn will go down, it will decrease. So if we design the prescribed fire program strategically targeting this the program that likely to increase the value, and then we're going to get success on prescribed burning. Also, there are certain group of landowners, they were found to be more supportive in prescribed fire. For example, younger landowner, wealthier landowner, and the landowner who are involved in assistance program previously showed the greatest support for the prescribed fire programs. So this suggests that the strategic marketing of program to select categories of forest owner can help increase the rate of return on investment in consulting, service, education, and assistance program.
You have about 4 minutes left.
And so here's the value of prescribed fire. This study showed a wide range of value associated with the prescribed burning. So using the mean willingness to pay value and assuming that Pennsylvania could burn 25% of private land, the total value of the prescribed fire in Pennsylvania could approach around 40 million annually. I use Pennsylvania as an example here because this data set is largely from Pennsylvania. So once we have data from other states, we'll give the tentative amount of the whole regional level. So if we can strategically design this program, then we can increase the value. For example, if burn programs include the most preferred attributes, the value will be 52 acres and total burning value statewide would be more than triple. So this value estimate suggests there is a real potential for establishing a viable marketplace where landowner can hire professionals that offer prescribed fire services. So with that, here is a one slide that summarizes key point of this study. So far, we've found a significant demand from landowner. So this shows the prescribed fire can be increased in Northeast. And so the value of prescribed burn vary based on landowner preference and characteristics. And there appear to be significant difference in willingness to pay value between Pennsylvania and Newark. There might be several reasons behind this. Some of the reason is like the weather conditions and the available burn window to get more burn acreage. And also the Pennsylvania landowner willingness to pay is higher in compared to the Newark landowner. So another important thing we found is the low level of knowledge. So this indicates that there is a need of a strategic program to improve landowner knowledge level. That could be the extension, education, or outreach to educate them so that we can increase the higher burn acreage. So another important factor, we found some attributes that were highly preferred and are likely to increase the value of prescribed burn, that are the benefit related to ecosystem health and resilience program to control ticks, and the cost share program to help a landowner in burning their land. With that, I'd like to conclude the presentation. If anyone have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm currently checking to see if we have any questions coming in through Huva, but we do have about a minute for questions. So if anybody would also like to unmute and ask their question, please feel free to. Last call for questions. All right, I want to thank you so much for speaking with us today. We're going to move on to our next.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next presenter, who is Doug. Doug, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen, and we'll let you go ahead and take over.
Anthony, are you still there, Anthony?
I am.
Okay, sorry. Let me try that one more time. All right, there. How's that look?
It looks perfect.
All right, perfect. Thanks, everybody. Good morning. I think it's still good morning for everybody across the country. It's going to be 73 degrees here in Las Cruces. So, but I wish we were in Florida. So, all right. So this follows the last talk well, I think. We in New Mexico, we're kind of still in the process of passing a prescribed burning act, and we're kind of in the rules process right now. So I thought we'd kind of cover that here this morning. So I love this. Get my pointer on here, actually. Oh, where is it? There we go. I love this research by Guyette in 2012. I think of it as I have it as a poster in my office. This is kind of like my paradigm shift slide. I've been using this a lot lately. I like Louisiana here, right? They're all one color, right? Just burn, baby, burn. But in the West here, obviously, it's a little more complex, if you will, a lot more colors. As we know, you change elevation and aspect and cover type, and the color changes. But nonetheless, this sort of speaks volumes when we're this message that of science showing that, you know, as we know, fire is a process. And in the West, of course, we spent any number of years trying to turn it all purple and blue, if you will, like, you know, fire suppression and exclusion. But again, as the last talk talked about, and as we're talking about, I think we're beyond that point. So how did we get there in New Mexico to our prescribed burning act? So and there's been more history, but our recent history in 2016, we had a House Memorial 49 that basically said fire is good. And then more substantially in 2019, House Memorial 42 that said the legislature said that we want this working group, the established working group, to put together a report that talked about expanding the use of prescribed fire in New Mexico. So not just like, hey, tell us if fire is useful, but you know, really, how can we expand fire in New Mexico? So there was a core team put together. I was a part of that, and we, along the way, we kept our stakeholders, which included NGOs and a few agencies, and certainly landowners and lawmakers eventually sort of abreast. But this reminds me, so this is a law that we passed for just for private landowners. Of course, it doesn't speak to federal agencies or state land. And so in our, I call it HM 42, in that report, there were a number of guidelines and guardrails, as I sort of call them, that the working group established and shared with lawmakers and stakeholders and legislatures. And those were largely put into the act. Now, I should point out here, like, no act is ever perfect. And so we're kind of working through that right now. So I have this kind of big arrow here. And so the act largely reflected what was recommended in the report. And I have this kind of skinny red line arrow from HM 42 to the draft rules. So that's where we're at now. And so from my perspective, I would have liked to seen a few more of the recommendations from the report go into the draft rules. So as you may well know, you really can't understand what the act is going to do without the promulgated rules. So that's where we're at right now. Those were just published in 2021, and they're out for public comment right now. So it's still yet to be seen how these actually function and how this whole combined act and rules will play out. One thing I think we did get right in the act was it talked about it established prescribed burning and not as in the public interest and not a nuisance, and that a private landowner has a right to conduct a fire. One of our challenges that I think right now is the act kind of said burning is a right, but the rules sort of say it's more of a privilege. So there could be some a little bit of notching heads there. We'll have to see. So where are we at now? The draft rule creates simple negligence in New Mexico for private landowners. There's some sort of I don't know. Some folks suggest in New Mexico that historically there are 3 publications that suggested we are undefined. In other words, were we simple or strict? We don't really know. Right before we passed the act, it was discovered, or there was an 1882 territorial statute that said, actually, if you set fire to the prairie, woods, or marshes, so clearly some 1882 language there, that you are strictly liable for double damages. And so that's actually in the criminal code of the law. So even though it was a civil act. So some confusion there. Either way, what we have now is a certification for pile burning and broadcast burning, 2 different certifications. And the key is if you get certified, then you're exempt from the double damages. And so unfortunately, in my perspective, the double damages, we probably should have got rid of that. I'm not quite sure how that got left in there. There's no other state in the union that has double damages as it relates to prescribed fire, and hardly anywhere. As you know, for example, if you involved in a fender bender, you know, whoever's negligent pays, but they don't pay twice. So to get certified for pile burning, other than S110, there's a 9-element online course. There'll be a proficiency workbook. There's a few waivers, but generally speaking, certainly this one, NWCG, single resource boss, these aren't really readily available to landowners. and there'll be a recertification process every 5 years. For broadcast burning, it's going to be a little more of a challenge. NWCG S190, S290, burn plan writing course, a 9-element online course. Again, a proficiency workbook. We're not quite sure what that's going to look like. It may be 1 to 3 burns where you need to, again, show proficiency, and a few waivers that, generally speaking, won't apply to many private landowners. So again, from my perspective, I think there's a few shortcomings to the draft rule from a functionality standpoint. Again, the overarching goal was to expand the use of prescribed fire, but by design, proficiency standards are meant to be a barrier. So I think that is kind of headed in the wrong direction. I think that's inappropriately rigorous. So we have a simple negligence clause now, and that actually, looking into what simple negligence does, it actually provides quite a bit of rigor in and of itself. I think the proficiency standards are a bit maladapted. One of our challenges for probably across the West is that we don't have that culture of maybe the Southeast and the Midwest of burning. And so producers need opportunities to burn. But proficiency standards basically say you have to get proficient first and then you can burn. But if you have the double damages hanging over you, it may be difficult to even get that experience to begin with. So there's been an acknowledgement that the broadcast burning will be more difficult, but by the same construct, I think even the pile burning, right? There's a proficiency barrier there, if you will. There'd be arguably some logistical bottlenecks, a legal nexus, some time and cost, and even therein, from a producer standpoint, an opportunity cost. So another part of the shortcoming in my mind, we actually put in language into the act that said it should be accessible, and that was the spirit of the word. The draft rule should make it accessible to landowners. That wasn't meant to be a legal term, which is able to achieve, right? I sort of joke, well, Spud Webb could play in the NBA, so clearly there's not a height limitation or a height restriction in the NBA, but you get the point. So realistic should be like, is it realistic for landowners? Does it make sense to them? Does it meet them where they're at, right? We appreciate there may be a cost in terms of time and money. So do these things make it accessible for your average landowner? Again, proficiency workbooks. It's a completed workbook signed by a certified burn boss who then accepts liability for the burn, 57 hours of coursework, a time commitment. Again, I'm not sure all these are super accessible to landowners. And here, I think is my biggest concern is the way the draft rules are set up create a logistical bottleneck and a legal nexus. So you have to find someone that is certified. So imagine you think about a ride sharing app. So you open up your phone and you see where the closest car is and something about them and how soon they can be there, and you can pick and choose. Well, to burn as a private landowner, you're gonna need to find somebody that's certified. Of course, you won't have that app to say, where are they, right? So who are they? How do you find them? Are they willing to come to your property? And then after all that, are they willing to serve as a certified burn boss? And to get rid of the double damages, they have to accept the liability for the burn, sign off on your proficiency workbook, which could create a legal nexus. And again, one of our challenges in New Mexico is it's hard to get insurance to burn. Most of our farm and ranch policies, unlike say Oklahoma or Kansas, don't sort of have that. It's not accepted a practice that your farm and ranch policy will cover in terms of insurance prescribed burning. So there's some challenges therein, right? And then you think about getting to a remote location. Oftentimes the producer wakes up, says, oh, it's snow on the ground, I think I'll burn today. But again, you'd have to wait for someone to find it's got to be right for them, for you, and for the weather. So there could be some challenges there, including some costs potentially. So these all create burn opportunity challenges. I think if landowner cannot reasonably in a timely manner burn on their own property, then again, you lose the opportunity to get more experience. Collectively, this could be a disincentive. It could even sort of incentivize, now that we have double damages, the first question your neighbor's going to ask, if there was damage, were you certified? So I think we have some challenges there. I really wanted to save time for some questions. Actually, I have 10 more minutes, looks like. Is that right, Anthony?
That is correct. You have 10 more minutes.
Actually, so I got 5 minutes okay, so I think I can kind of go through this. That was pretty quick. So one sort of and I'm a little bit over my skis here, I'm not a lawyer, right? But I used to show this slide when we were before the act, sort of suggesting where New Mexico, actually we said New Mexico, we're not really where we're at. Again, 3 publications that suggested we are undefined, either somewhere between strict and simple. And of course, Wonk et al. Provides evidence that gross negligence, as we know, encourages burning. But I sort of, so now that we have simple, and we also have the certified prescribed burn certification, I think that causes some challenges. And my argument actually is that the difference between simple and strict is pretty narrow in a prescribed fire sense, right? That line between the two. And the reason I say that is this nice publication from Hinojosa here in 2020, where they looked at, I think they queried about 130 judges in Oklahoma and Texas, not just shy of 30 responded. And if you look at the black lines, that's what judges thought would be qualify as simple negligence. For example, burning out of prescription, failing to cease an ignition out of prescription. I really like this one, failing to have a cell phone on hand. But of these 13, that they all think, in fact, even some even thought that would be gross negligence. The point is that there's not a whole lot of latitude with simple negligence if there's a spot fire that transitions to an escape fire and causes damage. So in other words, I think the simple negligence does a pretty good job of providing rigor. If you don't have some sort of training, you don't just wing it. I like to think of Aldo Leopold. You may be comfortable using the axe and the plow and the sprayer, let's call it, but maybe not so much the match, right? You really appreciate that using the match can be problematic. And simple negligence, I think, does a good job of providing rigor to well, for those that are for your neighbor as well as yourself. Is one more, I won't get into this, but check out Hand's formula, and particularly the P here. If P is the probability the plaintiff will suffer a loss should they engage in an action in question. When a spot prescribed fire is transitioning from a spot fire to escape fire, the P is, I would argue, really high, the probability that something could go wrong for your neighbor. Okay, so summary. Again, I think Arizona, I maybe forgot to mention this, Arizona, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, right? They don't have prescribed burning acts yet in the West. And so this may be of use to them. I think, again, as I mentioned, see, the right language is critical, right? A right to burn, not a nuisance, I think is useful. We got that part, I think, right in the act. The certified prescribed burn manager language, I think may have, mostly because maybe of our double damages issue, causes some problems. Is it necessary or not, considering simple negligence? I don't think it was. Virginia, South Carolina, and Alabama are examples of states that do have certified prescribed burn managers and don't have proficiency standards and significant logistical barriers. I think Oklahoma actually could be a model for the West. Their prescribed burn act. It's basically simple negligence. No certified prescribed burn manager program, no proficiency standards, no significant logistical barriers or NWCG courses. And also, I looked at Florida and Georgia. They went back to the legislature multiple times to kind of get their act where they wanted it. And so I think we may need to do that in New Mexico. We'll see, to build up that culture of burning. So it looks like I'm like, oh, one more slide. So where are we at in New Mexico? The draft rules are written. They're out in the register, so they're open for public comment. And now is the time for continuous rigorous debate on how that may or may not benefit us. And so I got plenty of time for questions, I see. So I'll stop there and see what we got.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Doug. So we got a couple questions for you. So the first one is, hi, Doug, any appetite to move up to the gross negligence standards? And that came from Zachary.
So I think they both can work. My perfect scenario would be we have a gross negligence standard where you obviously then you might need some of these more rigorous training, right? Because gross does provide a lot more confidence in burning. I don't like to use the word protection because it's not meant for that. So, but then if you're not certified, if you don't go through all the steps to get there, then you'd have a simple negligence clause. So I think the two in combination could be useful.
Zachary, would you like to unmute? I also see that you had a comment that came after that, and I think it'd be a great moment for discussion for a moment or two.
Oh, sure. Yeah, if you can hear me, just the challenge of getting more private landowners to burn, and under the different state rules and laws, sort of not forcing them, but requiring them to follow NWCG standards is tricky. I think a lot of it depends, of course, upon the state rules and law. But I think that's also a barrier to getting more private landowners to burn. Many private landowners really they want to learn more about staying safe on the fire line. All the years I've been teaching the lower S courses, I've seen a steady increase of private landowners who have no notion to go fight wildfire, but they want to learn more. But at the same time, like in Florida, you don't need any S courses to be a certified prescriber or manager. Just pass the coursework and follow the rules and regulations in the statutes. But it's this interesting blend where I think there is a desire to learn more, but the requirement to have such strict standards, I think it is a barrier to many private landowners. It's tricky. I definitely get it. But yeah, this is a great presentation.
Thanks, Zach. I appreciate those comments.
Thank you. Our next question is from Laurel. Laurel asks, does the act address cultural burning by tribes specifically in any way?
So no, it does not. I think our tribes, I'm not an expert on this, basically they would be exempt from this, right? They're just to private landowners, outside of tribal lands. So there was a recommendation in our HM 42 that sort of like New Mexico is unique, right? My wife's from Boston. I always joke, if the Pilgrims had come to New Mexico in 10, they could have stayed at a hotel in Santa Fe. We've had folks up and down the Rio Grande Valley since 1536. So there's this unique cultural and traditional use of fire in New Mexico that we were hoping it would be more embraced, and I don't think it quite made it there. Kind of to Zachary's point, people have been using fire, and if you make them sort of have a proficiency standard or make them jump through flaming hoop, let's just call it, then it's more difficult, and you can't sort of continue to build fire experience from the ground up. It's sort of like from the top down. So, but I think the short answer to your question, Laurel, is no, mostly because this wouldn't impact them strictly on tribal lands.
Thank you for that response. We have about 2 minutes left of this session. So does anyone else have a question they would like to ask? Feel free to unmute at this time, if so.
I'd comment a little more on Zach's point.
Sure.
It is interesting trying to, in fact, there's someone there in Tall Chambers, I think, that's sort of looking at that very issue of getting more non-NWCG courses. And of course, I don't think any of us have any problem with NWCG courses. It's just whether or not it's appropriate for landowners. For example, I think the burn plan writing course is 32 hours, right? And as a private landowner, there's an opportunity cost. What else could I be doing with my time, with my 32 hours? Of course, when it's online, I think it makes it a little more on demand, a little more accessible. But again, trying to find these classes and opportunities for landowners to meet them where they're at is definitely a challenge. And I think that's what I argue from the ground up, over a 20-year period, if we can go out extension and all of our NGOs and maybe hopefully someday like state forestry and our state land office, if they can provide burn opportunities. Right now there's a law that prevents them from doing that. But the more folks providing opportunities to burn, including your neighbors that's burning, if you go burn with them, right? That's how I think in the West we can slowly build up to match our brethren there in the Southeast and in the Midwest.
Thank you so much for that, Doug. I appreciate you presenting today. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Ryan, if you would like to come on and start sharing your presentation, and we'll get you started.
Is everything good to go?
Let's go ahead and start.
Great. My name is Ryan Wilbur, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Wyoming. And I want to thank everybody for being here today. And today I'm going to talk about the art of ranching with fire, social and ecological factors affecting the spread of pyrodiversity in ranching communities. And kind of like everybody has talked about so far, I kind of want to give just a backdrop of prescribed fire as a management tool, It's been identified that it can help reduce hazardous fuels to potentially mitigate wildfires. It can help maintain grassland ecosystems and rangelands by reducing shrub encroachment. And it's also been shown to potentially help livestock productivity at being used as a management tool. So with those in mind, like you can kind of imagine prescribed fire being used as fairly widely throughout the West, but as we all kind of alluded to, it really hasn't been used that often. And it's very spatially and specific to different areas. So that's what this research was really looking at, was trying to understand that narrative, that idea of which individuals are tending to utilize fire, but at the same time, which ones are not as well, and trying to just understand that a little bit better. And so before I wanted to get going with that, I wanted us to take a second and think about what our fire narrative is. What do we think of with prescribed fire, wildfire, or just fire in general? So some of us might be thinking about a time where we assisted or were a part of prescribed fire, and we had an objective, we had the prescriptions just right, we had everything line up well, and we lined it up and everything went really well and met the management objective. At the same time, there might be someone who had that same objective and prescriptions and everything, and then a rabbit caught on fire and ran across to the neighbors or public land and started a prairie fire. Or someone like myself who had initially just had an experience of sitting around a fire with their family and to discuss stories. So these experiences and more and attitudes kind of can go through ranchers specifically and to potentially use it as a management tool. So it's just kind of thinking about that. And so what we did, we interviewed ranchers across 6 different states to really try to understand that fire narrative. We asked a lot of different questions, social and ecological, related to just ranching management as a whole, but also just as it relates to fire, prescribed fire and wildfire. And then the idea is to eventually use a grounded theory approach to kind of figure out how some of these different variables overlap and work together to make those decisions, whether they decide to use fire or not. And so here are the results. We interviewed 81 individuals across these 6 different states. We had a diversity of individuals through each state. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm only going to be looking at the state of Wyoming. And so you can see the orange indicates where in the state these individuals were at by county. And then also I want to make a caveat that one of these individuals operates in 2 states, so I haven't quite figured out how I want to identify that individual, so I'll only be talking about 10 of them. So a few demographics, 3 of them are ranch managers, 7 are family operators. All of them have a mix of public and private. It's a checkerboard of a state for using that. 3 of them also lease private land. And then everybody's a cow-calf operator, but has some combination or just cow-calf specifically of stockers or sheep and goats or both, and so it's kind of a diversity of individuals. And then also I want to identify, say that ranchers in Wyoming really do it because they love it. They grew up doing it and they really had no other thought in their mind of anything else they wanted to do. And then to add to that, I want to kind of provide a little bit of backdrop of Wyoming ranching in general, just because it can be considered a little nuanced at times. So some of the ecological challenges that these ranchers face, not knowing until it happens, the unpredictability of ranching from year to year. And what that kind of means and alludes to is the weather and not being able to understand or perceive what the weather is going to look like, and looking at it even further, looking at drought, precipitation, the timing of precipitation, and trying to figure that part out and trying to adapt from year to year based on those ideas. And then there's other things like wildlife, competing species for forage. Prairie dogs is a huge concern just because it is potentially going to be listed, as well as sage grouse. So those are some competing, not just for forage, but also for just land capacity to operate, and then elk as well. There all are other concerns with predators, but these were the three big ones that were discussed. And then there's also concerns for invasive, trying to battle some of these invasive species that might outcompete some of the native range. And in Wyoming, the biggest discussion is cheatgrass. They recognize there's no silver bullet, and so they're trying to constantly adapt and manage for those as well. And then more on the social challenges of things, you know, keeping expenses low, probably one of the biggest ones that was discussed, just because things break, and trying to maintain ranching as best they can. And then the other aspect of it, because there's so much public land, sometimes the public can be some of the biggest challenges as well, working with management agencies, working with the public who have different views of the landscape of whether cows should be on the land at all or not. And so that kind of leads to this idea of we have to get along with people, we have to work with people. And so those relationships can be strained or good or bad. And just trying to navigate that can also be a challenge for these ranchers. So switching back to the Wyoming fire experience and what people found, what I found was that 5 individuals definitely use it as a tool, while 5 do not. And kind of a caveat to that is for the fire, 2 of them currently use it, and 3 had historically used it, but do not continue to use it as a tool. So looking more specifically at the fire users, with the 5 that has or had used it historically, it really relates back to reducing sagebrush ecosystems or sagebrush in general. They really found a benefit for opening up the landscape and increasing grass production that really benefits their livestock. So that all of them kind of referred to that. One of the hurdles, like kind of alluded to, is the sage grouse. So sage grouse has been petitioned for listing, and so 2 of the ranchers really talked about how they don't want it to be relisted, and trying to, so that takes sage or burning off the table. And as you can kind of see, that in combination of just the public interface, or that can really impact whether you want to use fire or not. And then the final individual, that historically had used fire, he had burned all the sagebrush that he really felt he needed to burn, and was, because sagebrush takes so long to come back onto the landscape, they just didn't, he met his objective and felt that they didn't need to use it anymore. And then there's 2 individuals who currently use prescribed fire. One is a little more hesitant about it, but there's a caveat to that individual is that he considers themselves as a guinea pig / research operation. So they allow people to come on to utilize their land for testing things out or trying things out. And so that was they had used fire as to remove invasive species as well. And then the other individual is more of a gung-ho, ready, really wanting to get rid of sagebrush in any capacity. So they kind of go out and are willing to, if the day looks right and the conditions are right, really getting out there to burn that sagebrush up. And then looking at the prescribed fire hesitant people, 2 of these individuals really had actually kind of seen the benefits of using prescribed fire. So that's not really the issue, not a concern. Either it was on public land, so public agencies had used prescribed fire, or they had bought the ranch and knew that there was a prescribed fire that had done it. So they see the benefits, but one individual talked about how we just don't have a lot of sagebrush, so we don't really see it as a need or a need for that area. But as well, the other individual talked about with the public land interface and needing that land for grazing, some of the management just isn't using prescribed fire, and they can't really do anything about that. And they felt that the management overall reduces some of that availability of a resource like grass. And then all of the 5 individuals are worried about forage. They would rather see cows utilizing that resource than let it burn up. You know, they just couldn't see that for burning up good grass. And also because of the, issues or concerns with that public lands, that there is a lot of mandates saying that you have to wait 2 full years for to allow for you to regraze. So they don't really want that prescribed burning being done on public lands. And another thing I would like to add is that not only do these individuals are concerned about forage, but also some of the people that were historically burning were concerned about making sure there was forage availability as well. And then there's also the concern of this getting out of hand, this escaping and burning up structures or running over into neighbors' properties as well. So, and this was also kind of talked about a little bit with some of those historic burners as well. So it's just some takeaways that I wanted to talk about. You know, there is a diversity of burning in Wyoming. It's not so binary of a 0 and 1. There are people that have used it. There are some hurdles. Seems like everybody tends to want to burn for sagebrush to really open up that landscape. But there is also concern with sage grouse potentially being listed and not wanting to burn up that habitat, because once it's gone, it's pretty much gone. And then there's also concerns for forage availability, especially if pushing for opening up the landscape on public land and having to wait 2 full years before they're able to get back on it. And they would rather just utilize the resource now, because they're working to try to work from year to year, and the adaptability of just unknowing circumstances from year to year. And then there's the concern for escape. So next steps, I really want to look at ecological things like drought and precipitation and how it relates to that forage production. Experiences with wildfires, just anecdotally, there are some people that had wildfires on their property, but also things adjacent. And then the process, some of those individuals who have used prescribed fire and how that works within their management decisions. Some social capacities that I'm interested in is just culture. It is quite diverse. Some people stated nobody burns around them, so that's part of it. And then, or they're the only ones that burn. And then just the education around that. Some other interesting things I'm interested in is using a mixed methods approach and kind of combining some of these spatial precipitation layers, as well as drought, vegetation composition, fire indicators, you know, a lot of these different things, and overlay that to either support or kind of see if there's some differences as I look at some of these other states. I want to thank all my contributors, all the people that were willing to interview with me, especially during a time of COVID over the phone, and just some of these other participants. Thank you for your time. That's all I have.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate it. I'm currently looking at Hoover to see if we have any questions for you, but I also, as always, want to recommend that if you have a question, feel free to unmute and ask your question directly to Ryan at this time. Not seeing anything quite yet. Hello, Michelle. Are you looking to ask a question?
No, I'm horribly fumbling with my phone, trying to figure out how to get back to the view. Sorry.
No problem. Does anyone have a question at this time?
Hi, could I ask a question?
Of course you can.
So there's a real disconnect or dichotomy, I guess, between what you just presented and what I've been hearing in a lot of the sessions where I've been involved, or for the fire and invasive species relationship, in that there's a lot of concern about too much fire in the sagebrush region, whereas the ranchers, or because of the sage grouse, whereas the ranchers, of course, are seeing it as that there's too much sage. I'm just wondering if you saw a big or many differences between, say, Wyoming, where sage grouse is a big issue, and other states where sage grouse aren't as big of an issue, in how accepting they are of prescribed fire or problems that they see with the public land?
Yeah, so there are some, thinking about Colorado and Montana, they do have sagebrush, and they do talk about trying to open that area up a little bit more. But yes, there were still conversations about sage grouse and being concerned about that. That could have been just the groups that the individuals that are able to talk to. But there are also concerns on the public land, just generally about the forage availability. And it kind of is an interesting topic to think about, just because if you burn sagebrush, then you have the potential for sage or for more production. But this is really preliminary. I haven't really dove as much into the Colorado and Montana quite yet, but just thinking anecdotally, just when I was listening and transcribing everything, there are other social factors of, I don't know anybody that burns. I'm worried it kind of falls to a concern for it getting away and not being able to utilize that landscape for a while because of dry conditions.
Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Does anyone else have a question for Ryan at this time?
Hey, Ryan, this is Jackie can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I had a question a little bit about, like that 2-year mandate that, people talk about, like how much have you delved into, like, is that a real thing or is it a perceived thing? Because I know that there was some research the ARS did on, it wasn't in sagebrush, but it was near Lemon, South Dakota on the Poultry Fire. And they were showing if you have adequate precipitation the year after that, you could graze it. So, and that's a different system than what you're talking about now. But like, what have you found out about that?
Yeah, I haven't really dove in too deeply on the actual whether that's a for sure thing or not, but there's definitely some ranchers who had burned and they explicitly said they had to wait 2 years before they could actually utilize that land again. And then there was some other places like that had talked about that they had burned and there was conversation, like the relationships with the public agencies was okay. So they let them kind of mob graze it and move on really quickly. But yeah, it was articulated that it would definitely was we have to wait before we were allowed to be on there again.
Yeah, I find it interesting because if it's a policy, then it's like more uniform, and then if it's more of a suggestion and it's an interesting social aspect of that.
Yeah,
thanks, Ryan.
I definitely agree. And to add to that, so I had one individual who was like, I have heard that I have to wait 2 years. And then there was a couple of people who were like, absolutely, we have to wait. Like there's no discussion, even though we can see that it's there. And that might be also in truth to just precipitation and the unvariability of drought. A lot of them talk about drought quite a bit. So that could play into it as well.
Thanks, enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
So we have a little under a minute if we have any last questions, any quick questions. Otherwise, we'll move on to our next speakers. Last call. All right. Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate you speaking with us today.
Thank you, Anthony.
All right, so we're going to move on to our next speaker. Laurel, if you would like to come on and start sharing your presentation, and also if you would like to introduce everyone who will also be speaking with you as you go.
Great. Thank you so much. So yeah, we're going to be talking about results and recommendations from prescribed fire training surveys that were done in the Southeast and the Northeast. Today, it'll be me, Gary Wood, and Nick Skorowski speaking. Jennifer Fawcett, who is also a huge part of this project, is on as well to answer questions. Larry Mastick was not able to join, but he was a huge part of this project and definitely helped us put it together. So I'll hand it over to Nick to kick it off and give a little background about the Northeast part of this project. And sorry, I should have mentioned, we'll give you a little bit of background that Nick's going to cover. He'll talk about the Northeast survey, and then Gary and I will come back and talk about what we did in the Southeast based on their work.
All right, thanks, Laurel. It's not morning for everybody anymore, but good morning anyway. So I'm Nick Skaronski. I'm actually the chairman of the Prescribed Burn working group for the Northeast Regional Cohesive Strategy Committee. And you know, within the sort of bounds of this Cohesive Strategy Committee, we were trying to find ways that we could, you know, I know it's kind of cliche now to say increase the pace and scale of prescribed fire across the landscape, but really as a committee, we've been trying to find actionable items and real solutions as to how we could increase prescribed fire use in our region. And so we came up with, I would call it more of a questionnaire than a survey. It was not a scientific survey, but really just try to gauge the general feeling for prescribed fire use and the issues that are prohibiting prescribed fire use in our region. Next slide, please. So the questions of this particular questionnaire were focused on trying to understand how we could provide better training opportunities in our region. We had done a survey several years ago that really identified training as one of the main hindering factors as to why our regional agencies weren't able to burn as much as they would like to. And so we retailored things and created a training specific questionnaire. And we had a pretty good response rate from that questionnaire. Next slide, please. All right, so the observations I'll go through really quickly here were very just general. Prescribed fire in our region as a pretty low level of priority across our land management agencies. There's a ton of barriers that these agency personnel identified. Lack of training, lack of qualified personnel because of that lack of training, and other factors as well. Next slide, please, Laurel. And some of the other more specific things that we found is that there's not enough advanced courses being offered in our region to kind of meet those needs. We have a huge, you know, private and nonprofit sector in our region. You know, there's not nearly as much federal land in the Northeast United States. And there's really not much opportunity for these private folks and NGOs to get access to the same training that federal personnel are. Another huge issue that we find and run into more and more on this questionnaire and also in conversations is that, you know, the task books really require that sort of Western fire component. And I know that, you know, my own personal experience is that my task book is not going to be signed off if I haven't had experience on a Western wildfire. You know, there's just sort of this cultural barrier there. And a lot of our folks aren't interested in going west or in fighting wildfire. They're interested in using prescribed fires. So that's something that we definitely identified. Next slide, please. So we came up with a list of recommendations and we actually took some actions from this. We were successful in applying for wildfire risk and reduction funding from Region 9 last year, which allowed us to hire a regional prescribed fire training coordinator who's actually on this call, Zach Prusak, who's housed at Tall Timbers. Zach's job is to sort of coordinate training opportunities across our area, to develop virtual courses, to work with our agencies to have local cadre, and really to allow folks an opportunity to cross-pollinate and to train together. That in a way that doesn't really necessarily, you know, restricted to individual agencies or within individual state boundaries. So that was one of the main things that has come out of this so far. Next slide, please. So as I said, we did hire Zach, and we're also looking at other strategies to really try to develop our training capacity in the Northeast. I'll say, just sort of one of the issues that I think that we're seeing as to why we can't implement these things is just general lack of capacity across organizations and agencies. Everybody is already sort of underwater, I would feel, in our region. And, you know, there's really kind of a small group of folks that take on a large role in this realm. And I think that they're pretty much underwater at this point. We actually were considering applying for another WRR grant this year, and we really couldn't even find the hosting agency that was willing to take that capacity or that burden on. And so I think as we see some of these new funds getting dispersed in the next several years from the infrastructure bill and other other funding sources, that we're going to really struggle with our ability to roll those things out to the field because of the lack of sort of capacity to coordinate those things. So that's what I have. Thank you, Laurel.
Gary, it's on to you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm Gary Wood. I'm the Southeastern Regional Coordinator for the Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. And little background, looking at prescribed fire in the South, we implement more prescribed fire annually than any other region in the United States. Somewhere usually between 5 and 6 million acres of prescribed burning, primarily on forestry practices. Maybe another 1.5 million that goes into agricultural type practices. But we have a very diverse landscape. We have a landscape that maintains fire dependent ecosystems everywhere you turn around. We've got more private lands, just like Nick mentioned, in the Northeast than we do federal lands. Very fragmented landscape that's becoming more fragmented all of the time. And we'll see in some slides a little bit later on that, we have a lot of people that do a lot of prescribed burning, both on the professional career type folks as well as landowners. And when we look at the issue with prescribed burning in the Southeast, we know we've got a lot of non-forestry state agency type folks, such as your state parks, your fish and game departments, natural heritage program folks that do prescribed burning as well. And, we're always looking at that need for increasing the pace and scale that we can restore those ecosystems where fire has been removed from, put fire back in it as the natural process that it's supposed to be to maintain and support those ecosystems. Which as a result will give us healthy forests, which are resilient forests. Also reduce that wildfire risk. We have usually about 50% of the ignitions that occur from wildfires in the country each year occur in the Southeast. So a very wide use of prescribed fire. It's a cultural thing, been used for many generations, and we hope to get more folks doing it. Next slide, please, Laurel. When we looked at the survey itself, Larry and I talked, the Northeast coordinator, and thought, hey, why don't we do the survey, see, because we do so much prescribed burning, see what we could do cross-boundary wise. And we took the same questions as the Northeast used so we could compare apples to apples. But knowing we've got that diverse group of burners across our region, that's where we built in additional questions that focus on folks that are not wanting to follow the NWCG track, those private landowners. So thanks to Laurel and Jen and a lot of others, we came up with a survey. We distributed it in 2021 through a wide variety of partners. And man, did we get the responses, way more than we ever anticipated. 955 total responses. And if you look at the graph there on the screen, you can see that we had more state agency folks that responded. And the other thing was that we had more private landowners than we did folks that work with federal agencies that respond, which reflect that large base of prescribed burners that are not associated with federal agencies, but private lands as well. Next slide, Laurel. When we looked at what our observations were, and I think this was my slide, wasn't it, Laurel, or is it yours?
Go for it.
Okay, I wanted to make sure. Our biggest thing was folks having difficulty with access and training. You can look at this graph, and this was one of the things that showed a question of what are the difficult courses that are difficult to obtain to help you maintain NWCG qualifications. And you can see some more of those advanced type classes, but not only the NWCG classes, but we found out from the private burners that weren't looking at NWCG courses that oftentimes taking those state certified burn manager classes, there were some bottlenecks there. And I'm gonna kick it over to Laurel to go through more of our observations.
Yeah, and I'll say a lot of these observations were not shocking to us, probably won't be shocking to you if you're relatively familiar with prescribed fire in the Southeast. A lot of it was confirming what we already knew and giving us hard data to be able to act on those things. So Nick already mentioned capacity. That was a big thing that folks consistently brought up. There just aren't enough people not only to implement fire, but also to do the training that is needed. And there just needs to be more people who are qualified to do quite a few different things. Qualifications can be really difficult to navigate. Nick also touched on this. This is particularly true for folks who don't necessarily work for an agency that has suppression responsibilities or primary suppression responsibilities. So those fish and game agencies, state parks, the folks that Gary mentioned, it can be particularly difficult for them to navigate the NWCG qualifications that they may need. Not only to access those courses, but just to figure out how to do that, what courses exactly they need. And that quote, this orange and on the next slide are quotes we got in comments from folks, just really reiterating this idea that, you know, these people, a lot of people who responded to this survey really consider themselves prescribed fire experts first, not even necessarily identifying as wildland firefighters, and that NWCG structure just doesn't work for a lot of them. There were also a lot of issues brought up about agency guidelines and policies. So folks who really want to be able to collaborate together, burn across boundaries, all of that good stuff we always talk about. But there are issues with that based on the different requirements different agencies may have for partners that some folks may or may not meet. And again, that connects back to the qualifications issue of they may require qualifications that are difficult for certain agencies and organizations to get. And there was a huge interest, and we just happened to be doing this during COVID, when virtual and hybrid trainings are a big topic of conversation. So we put in a couple of questions about that as well for the formats of trainings that people preferred. And there was really significant interest among both NWCG and non-NWCG folks in having more virtual, more hybrid training opportunities available. So I won't read off all of these, and I think we have the link to the report on the last slide, and we can put that in the chat box too. But just, a lot of the good stuff that we're frequently talking about in conversations like these. We need more training. We need to be able to advertise training better, more opportunities, particularly hands-on opportunities, and hands-on opportunities, particularly for those non-NWCG, especially landowner folks who may have difficulty getting it. More hybrid and virtual trainings, addressing policies. Again, I won't read off all of these, but you can go back. We have the survey. We also have a one-pager of the survey that kind of summarizes things a little bit, that has a lot of this information in a more concise format. So I'll hand it over to Gary to talk a little bit about what we've got queued up next to address some of these things.
Well, this was a huge undertaking, and I do it all the time. I must give kudos to Laurel and Jen. They really helped carry the burden of getting this work done and put together. But underneath our regional strategy committee, just like Nick said, he chairs their prescribed fire work group. We've got a prescribed fire coordination work group within our regional strategy committee. Once I kind of get over the shell shock of what we've gone through of getting this final report together and out to everybody, we're going to bring in some folks to start looking at how we can prioritize those recommendations that came out. Really look at getting the right people working in some task groups that can hopefully move the needle forward on some of these items as well. One thing that Laurel and Jen and I will be doing is a webinar that will be on the Southern Fire Exchange through our Fire Learning Network on March the 3rd. And we welcome you to join there, where hopefully we'll have a little bit more time to go into a little bit more detail. But we've got a very diverse group of folks that we've got to pick to pull together to move things forward on these recommendations. Some of them we know are going to be easier to overcome than others. So one of the biggies is the funding issue. We're hoping that some funds will trickle out from the recent congressional bills that are there that can help aid us in funding and pushing these programs forward. We continue to coordinate and work with the Northeast a lot. Larry and I have been in discussion already and working on some papers and some pulling task groups together to look about what we can do to work to hopefully reduce some of the wildfire suppression requirements that go into the NWCG position task books to get folks qualified in those higher level prescribed fire positions. Everybody doesn't need to be an ICT4 to be able to go cross boundary, excuse me, and burn with one of their partner agencies. And so that's one of the things that we've really got to try to figure out is how we can change some of the mindset to get away from so much emphasis on that suppression role. Because like Nick said, there's a lot of people that never have any desire to go out west working fire suppression, but a lot of people that would really like to be able to obtain some of the higher level training classes that would help up their game to make them safer and more experienced burners down the road. And that's what it's going to take everywhere, not just in the Southeast, but all across the country, to get our folks to be able to go out and do prescribed burns safely and effectively. And so we're looking at what we can do within the region. We're also looking at what we can do across the region. So stay tuned. We hope there's a lot more things going to come out of this work. And I guess now we'll have some minutes here available for any particular questions that may come up from the folks in the audience.
And I'll just add one quick thing, just a huge thanks. I know a couple of folks on here really helped us distribute the survey and get it out. As Gary alluded to, we really didn't expect such a robust response. So huge thank you to everyone who participated or shared it or was part of the analysis piece.
Well, thank you both for speaking. We do have one question currently, which is really speaking directly to what you were just speaking about, Gary. So much of the solutions to increase training and mentoring comes down to funding positions that can focus on delivering trainings and connecting opportunities. Can anyone speak to the possibilities of directing a portion of new federal funding to such positions?
Yeah, we're hoping that, I can't tell you where we're going to put the money or how much is going to come. I don't control that. But we're hoping that in our recommendations that we can get some agency folks looking at increasing the capacity of their people to put training on the ground. We have more people needing training than we have seats available in classes or instructors to do the training, as well as the on-the-ground hands-on mentoring. So it's a huge issue there. It's not like going down to the local employment agency and hiring a forklift operator. It takes years of experience and knowledge to become a successful prescribed burn manager. And we've got to do a lot of catching up in a quick way, but we've got to do it safely. So we make sure we do it right. But yeah, we've got to have more people to increase that capacity, plain and simple.
Thank you so much, Gary. We have a little under a minute before we need to move on. I wanted to see if anyone had any quick questions left.
I just want to say that Zach has some really good comments in the chat for anyone interested on some of the stuff that he's working on in terms of hybrid training and some of these ideas for how to get landowners more training. And those have definitely been parts of the conversations we've had, but some really cool ideas for anyone interested.
I also want to note Laurel has put in those reports that were spoken about as links within the chat for anyone to go into. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and move on. I want to thank you both for speaking again. I really appreciate it. To our final speaker of this session, which is Andy. Andy, if you would like to come on and start your presentation.
All right, thanks everybody. Can you see my screen okay?
We can.
All right, great. My name is Andy Rappe, and I'm with the University of Florida's Ordway Swisher Biological Station. I've got about 16 years in fire, about 8 of that's working on burn crews, and then the rest of my time spent here at the station. So Ordway is a field station with a research, training, and extension mission. So this ties in very nicely, hopefully, to what Laurel and everyone else was talking about. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what we do, which is burning for research and training objectives specifically at the station. And this talk is honestly a little bit more practitioner based, but I'm hoping that for researchers, this is meaningful as well to kind of think about your experimental design and where operational folks are coming from and how we can kind of meet everybody in the middle and be really successful with our fire and research objectives. So here's Ordway. It's in North Central Florida, about 20 miles east of the University of Florida's main campus in Gainesville. See, we have this cool mosaic of different vegetation types, all of the kind of sand colored areas as well as sandhill. So it's about 3,500 acres of that. And then it's embedded in this matrix of wetlands and wet prairies and different successional hardwood forests, things like that. So when I'm talking about my training burns, I'm typically talking about burning in kind of the classic longleaf wiregrass pine savanna. So fuel model 2. So you have this nice grassy understory. It functions like a prairie ecosystem that happens to have pine trees on it, right? So what I can get away with in this resilient ecosystem with this fuels might not be one-to-one what you're doing research in or you're burning in, but I'm hoping that some of the strategies are broadly applicable if the tactics one-to-one are not. So a little bit more about Ordway's fire management program. When I'm talking about training today, I'm primarily going to be talking about burning with the Prescribed Fire Training Center, or PFTC. Been burning with these folks for about 20 years. I've been burning with them for about 10. And if you're not familiar with PFTC, these are typically mid-career fire professionals working on the National Wildland Fire Coordinating Group, NWCG qualifications as typically burn boss or firing boss, but these are typically Western suppression firefighters working on those higher level qualifications. They can be from all over the world, however, and increasingly we're seeing different agencies and folks in there, but that's primarily who we're talking about with training. If you're not familiar with kind of the Byzantine fire qualification world, just the main takeaway is these folks are in leadership high-level roles on the burns in a trainee capacity. So pull out some quick numbers here. In the last 5 years at the station, we've done 124 burns, the vast majority of which, about 85%, we've had cooperators on the burns. Cooperators can range from a volunteer, a student, an intern, all the way up to these trainee burn bosses. And my main takeaway for sharing that is just we're able to do this and still get quite a lot of fire on the ground. So we don't have the capacity to do these burns in-house, and we're able to leverage our education mission to get the work done. And then 75% just in the last year, the vast majority of these burns had research projects on them. And it's kind of a normal day for us if we've got, 3 research projects on a burn and it's a trainee burn and we have researchers out there. It's just kind of how it goes. And I hope to kind of talk about and have a conversation about how this really isn't a hindrance. It can help and strengthen your fire program or your research for that matter. So this will be kind of in 2 chunks. I'll focus on research first, followed by training. And there'll be some cross-pollination between the two and kind of thinking about how you run a burn and a fire program for that matter. You'll see there kind of goes back and forth between both. So I mentioned I did quite a number of years on fire crews before I came to the station, and I use humor as a tool to get a point across here. But this chart's a little bit of how you might have thought of a research burn going. Your supervisor is approached by a researcher. That involves a lot of emails, which involves a lot of prep work on the burn for you. And there's an opportunity cost of burning a 1/4 acre on a good burn day instead of a bigger unit. That results in subpublication. Maybe you don't know for a couple of years, and then the cycle starts all over again. But that has not been my experience. I have found that burning with researchers can increase your deliverables. This can be important as an administrator for reports, but it also kind of strengthens and deepens your fire program. And that makes for a good story. Now you're not just burning for hazard fuel reduction or a site prep burn or something of that nature. You're burning as part of this larger effort that might link to a national or even international effort. And you can also tie it to other dimensions that you might not have had before as part of your fire program: social sciences, firefighter health and safety, broad climate change initiatives, all sorts of things. And that's a good story. And you can pass that up to your stakeholders, and you don't necessarily have to tell it as a fire manager. You have all these other people champion your fire program through the research aspect. And that can result in some good press. Also, you can steer scientists towards meaningful land management questions. These folks are more than happy typically to talk to land managers and think through some applied science. And that goes the other way as well. You have a chance as a scientist to figure out what's going on the ground, what's important to land managers. It might not be what you think. So I've got some tactics I wanted to touch on. These are kind of nuts and bolts things that we found useful that'll hopefully get you thinking, even if it's not directly applicable to you. Way ahead of time, it's important to think about what your agency's requirements are to have researchers on a burn. Maybe nothing if you're a private landowner, maybe a whole lot depending on your agency, but can you sign them up as a volunteer? Can you have a fire observer role where they're tied to a firefighter within kind of eyesight for the day? What do you need? Is it just a waiver? But think through that stuff. Something else, we actually put training and research objectives in our prescriptions, and it's a subtle thing, but if you're doing a training burn and you're handing this prescription to somebody and they're going through it in the briefing, it really legitimizes what you're doing and puts that right at the front and center, that these are important, legitimate objectives. And they can be quantifiable for burning through research plots, for example, but we also do put that training objective in there. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. When you're getting rolling and getting out in the field, some things to consider. It sounds kind of silly, but do they have to be there? Can you replace that researcher with a pin flag? If you can, it opens up your burn window and you can kind of do things, have a little bit quicker pivot. Also think about putting their research equipment, if they have stuff on the ground, right there at test fire. That's what's going on in this picture. See, this person's doing some smoke research. He's got this cool equipment set up, and you can see a blurry fire truck in the background, and it's actually at the corner of 2 roads. So this really benefits everybody. This is a great tactic. It benefits the fire manager in that you've got all your people and your water right there. If you have to defend some fancy equipment or you need to let it smolder the entire day, this is a great chance to do that. From a researcher's perspective, they have the highest odds they're ever going to have that their stuff actually gets burned. If you put it out at test fire, they still got their smoke. So that's something to think about. And then to end on a practical note for this slide, have they set this up before in the field? If they haven't, you should probably get them to do it a couple days ahead of time and leave it up. If they have to do it the morning of, get a really good time of how long that's going to take. Get a couple dry runs, get that time dialed in. If it's going to take hours, maybe stick them in a burn unit where you're going to light that fire in the afternoon, but you want to avoid having to hold up your firing operations until the researcher has their stuff in the field. So these are some things to think about. I have them stay for the whole day, if at all possible. And I tell them that, when you're still at the very front end of this, at the very least, have the researchers sit through the whole briefing. I make them part of your org chart, get everyone's name, have all of going on the burn, write all that information down. And then I have them give their own little breakout section in the briefing and give a 2-minute summary of what their stuff is on the ground and why it's there. So you can see this Pelican case, half these wires were very important to burn and half of them were very important not to burn. So getting that kind of stuff. Do they want you to put it out, not put it out, all that good operational stuff. And then determine any non-fire, I call them bonus qualifications. Do you have a drone pilot there? And they're flying that as part of their research. That's handy. Is it a summer burn and they've got a truck you can pack people into if you need some air conditioning? That's handy. So think through things like that. And now they're kind of working for your operational tempo and not against it. During the burn, I treat them like a squad to maintain span of control. So say I've got 4 researchers, I designate one as kind of the chief of party, give them a radio, teach them how to use it. We call them science on the radio, keep things simple. And you have that point of contact for everything you need. Works pretty well. Are they taking weather anyway? Taking weather is really just reading out data on the radio. Researchers are great at taking data. You can train them up on how to use a Kestrel, any other kind of means of taking weather, and now they're working for you. Especially if you've got the science out of the way early in the day at that test fire and they're going to be there all day, what can they do for you? Some other things to think about. Can they do traffic control? Can they be a smoke spotter and look at that column, especially if you're in a wildland urban interface area? Or can they just take pictures? Never underestimate the value of documenting what you're doing. And you're usually tied up as a burn boss and not able to do that. And you might need them for like a presentation one day or something like that. So these are all good things to think about. And again, the overall intent is to get them moving with you and helping you out on the burn. Post burn, I include them in the debrief as well. And this isn't just firing operations and safety stuff in the debrief, but also their experimental design. We have research projects that might be there for years. And you can see this person's lighting around a metal and concrete groundwater monitoring well. There's one just out of the frame that was made out of PVC that's maybe got a little bit more of a lean to it, been melted a few times. So think about what they can do better for their research design and include that in your debriefing. Also, just common sense stuff, get their contact information to get those pictures you had them take, to get that publication a couple years down the road, and then to get any equipment they may have walked away with. These usually aren't folks that are on a ton of fires, so get that hard hat back, all that good stuff. So just to shift gears to training a little bit. Again, I'm using humor as a tool here, but for me, 100-acre nice sandhill burn, 9 people's about the sweet spot. Here we've got 10, great, more than enough. You can see only 2 at the bottom are kind of doing the actual work. These are the firefighter type 2 that's lighting and the engine operator that's doing your holding. And the rest are overhead or leadership positions. So you have this redundancy of having a trainee role and a trainer role, and that's eating up a lot of space on the fire. So it's an exaggeration, but this is a kind of a worst case scenario for a training burn organizational chart. So how do we get around that, and why should we? Well, the obvious one is training the next generation of firefighters, but I would argue these points as well that maybe are a little bit less obvious. It benefits your staff. You become a better student of fire by becoming a teacher of fire. It also fights complacency, at least in my area in these sandhills. I'm burning them every 2 to 3 years. So it fights that urge for your in-house staff to say, well, we'll do it like we did 2 years ago. That did great. Are conditions different? Is the fuel loading different? Do you remember how you did it 2 years ago? So it fights that complacency. It also builds interagency relationships. So at least for me personally, I wouldn't burn with federal firefighters very often, if at all, if it weren't for working with these trainee programs through PFTC. So I'm able to strengthen those relationships. Myself and my staff are able to say, kind of sharpened up on our ICS stuff and work through, if we do have a big interagency wildfire or incident, we're able to kind of be sharpened up for that. You're also able to kind of cherry pick the best parts of these different agencies and incorporate that into your fire program over time. And the other side of that, you have to have a little thicker skin, but you're able to see your fire program through other agencies' eyes and kind of get feedback on that, of what you can improve or what you're doing really well that different folks from different parts of the world are really touching on. So those are all good things. You can also, to end on a practical note, build black for bigger burns. So a lot of times with these trainee burns, we might be doing smaller burn acres, but that's setting us up around a periphery of a bigger unit that we can then burn with less holding resources, or maybe burn faster at a more challenging time of year, which for us would be those growing season burns in June, for example. So there's some strategy there. I could throw this out. I mentioned I give the trainee burn boss the prescription on the burn, and some other folks brought this up in that last session, which was excellent, of using a burn manager. So on the local burn boss, it's actually pulling the permit for that day. We'll call the burn manager. And this does a couple things. One is it alleviates confusion on the radio. You don't have a burn boss and a burn boss trainee. That's a key position. So you want to make sure you're getting the right person in a timely fashion. So we use the burn manager qualification to alleviate that. It also cuts down on that org chart. The burn manager is a floater walking around the field, and they're kind of interfacing with the burn boss trainee and the firing boss trainee. So that's one way to kind of strategize and reduce that org chart as well. Other tips, we'll have a separate overhead briefing with folks in a leadership role. While that's going on, the locals are going over the equipment with everyone else that's going to be on the fire. And then I'll seed locals in. So if there's an engine with 2 people, 1 will be a local. If there's a squad lighting the interior of the unit with 4 people, 1 will be a local. And the intent of this is to cut down on that org chart further. And now you have these informal kind of handler roles that can step in if things go south, but they can also mentor people in the field and still empower them to actually do the positions that they need to do to get that training. So that works pretty well for us and is fairly efficient and cuts down on time and the overall amount of leadership roles you need. And then in any training scenario, just kind of ask questions for the good of the group, even if you know the answer, and be in that mindset the whole time.
Andy, just so you know, you have about 4 minutes left.
All right. So during operations on the burn, I mentioned we'll have that burn manager as a floater, kind of walking around in the field. You can see me kind of nervously standing in between the fire and this tower, but they're wandering around and talking to that firing boss and that burn boss face to face. When they're doing that, I found on training burns, it's important to explicitly state, this is my intent of telling you this, or this is my desired end state, or conversely, this is not my desired end state. My desired end state is not to see the tower melted, things like that. And then in that overhead briefing, I'll set trigger points, or in the field, I'll set trigger points. And these are just practical things of saying, if we're at this area by 1400, then we'll get a face-to-face and decide if we're going to continue and burn out this extra unit. Or if we're going to get a spot fire, a test fire, we've set a trigger point that we'll get a face-to-face and talk about the weather and the likelihood of continuing, things like that. So to kind of have this mindset with yourself and all your folks talking through with trainees throughout the burn. And then finally, when you debrief on a training burn, I talk through who's going to check the burn. If you're staying on the station and you're burning for an entire week, if you're the trainee burn boss in that burn, it's your burn for the entire week. So I have them drive around it, I have them check it, I have them give us updates. And that is important to make it as realistic as possible. You're squeezing all the training you can get out of that burn, even days later. So I think that's important to think about. And another thing, if you're doing, especially if you're doing task book stuff for the trainees, do they have any kind of, I'll call them exotic tasks, so a high up chainsaw qualification or weather qualification or something like that, that they're willing to kind of reciprocate with your locals and sign off on their task books. And this is a way to get the work done and to motivate your local staff and get them excited about these trainee burns, which are a little bit more work, and kind of get them into it as well. So those are some things to think about. So I'm coming to the end here, and hopefully I've convinced you that this isn't just kind of an anchor around you for something that's hard and dangerous and expensive to do anyway. It's worth it to do these other things, because if you do it right, they make your burn program not only better, but they help you out, and they move things along and can really deepen and make your fire management program better. And if you're a researcher, I hope you've kind of seen my mindset and how we're thinking about things as we move through this process together. So I'm happy to take any questions. I think I did a little better on time than anticipated, so I'm excited about that. But you can also get me via the email address below. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andy. We do have one question, and we have about a minute left. So the question comes from Zachary. Thanks, Andy, for your leadership in being such an integral part of the fire training in the region. Do you envision UF adding or accepting more acres to the station? And also, are you excited for Doom Part 2? Good question.
Yeah, absolutely. I certainly hope so. We're always looking for more opportunities. So yes, Zach.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time and for being here with us again today. And I want to thank all our speakers. You all are fantastic. We appreciate you all. So as a reminder, this session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks of the end, 2 weeks after the end of the Congress. Up next, we have about a 20-minute break, followed by 5 general sessions, 1 special session, and 2 fire circle discussion sessions. To choose the one you'd like to join, use the agenda tab to the left of your screen and click sessions and click the main session title to join. To join the session offering Spanish and Portuguese interpretation, be sure to select the session titled Fire Behavior. Thank you again to all of our speakers and thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.